Welcome to Decarceration Nation, a podcast about radically reimagining America's criminal justice system. You can find all previous episodes on our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. And if you like the podcast, please remember to hit like and to subscribe to the channel below. Dana Sussman is the acting executive director of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women and oversees the organization's litigation, coalition building, research, and operations. Prior to NAPW, Dana served for 6 years as Deputy Commissioner of Policy and Intergovernmental Affairs at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. She's also worked for Safe Horizons Anti-Trafficking Program, the Center for Reproductive Rights, and Oughton and Golden LLP. She also clerked for Magistrate Judge James Ornstein in the Eastern District of New York. Welcome to the Decarceration Nation podcast, Dana.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. I always ask the same first question. It's kind of the comic book origin story question, which is, how did you get from wherever you started in life to where you were the executive director for the National Advocates for Pregnant Women?
I'll start about halfway through, which is that I went to law school only to do reproductive rights. I decided that was my issues surrounding bodily autonomy, in people's decision-making, the way people want to chart their life and their life course was something that resonated deeply with me. I'm not sure why, it just did. And so I went to law school, and with that in mind, that was the sole purpose. And I found my way to the Center for Reproductive Rights as a legal fellow, as my first job out of law school. Got a little bit of a sort of boot camp orientation into abortion rights lawyering and litigation, but felt somewhat frustrated at the narrow scope of their work because they were so focused on keeping clinics open. This was in the mid-2000s when they were fighting against targeted regulation of abortion providers, really unsexy things like your hallways have to be double the width of every other ambulatory surgical center in the state. You have to have a parking lot that has 100 spaces. Those kinds of things that no one really cared about, that got passed, or regulations were issued without anyone noticing, and it would shut down clinics all over different states. So we litigated those cases and other restrictions on abortion providers. But they're so focused on keeping those clinic doors open that they were unable to take on the cases that I found myself really passionate about, issues surrounding pregnant prisoners, issues surrounding pregnancy discrimination, really connected to the reproductive rights fight, but not within their lane, so to speak. Took a winding path after that, took on different types of civil rights issues, between employment discrimination to worker exploitation, and ended up back at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, which is an organization I've been following for its entire life. It's been around since 2001, because they were taking on those fights that no other organization was taking on, and that's defending the rights of pregnant people who are facing criminalization because of their pregnancies or because of their pregnancy outcomes. And so I was thrilled for the opportunity to join the organization. And I became the acting executive director when our ED went on sabbatical for the first time in her career. So here I am. The first day of her sabbatical was the day the Dobbs decision was leaked. And that's either amazing timing for her or terrible timing for her, depending on how you see it. And we are now in a whole new world, unfortunately.
Well, speaking about the Dobbs decision, in case anyone listening doesn't entirely understand the basics, you don't have to go too crazy, but could you summarize the Dobbs decision?
Sure. So the Supreme Court took up a case in which Mississippi had passed a law banning abortion after 15 weeks gestation. Up until this point, really up until the Supreme Court's current configuration was set up under the last presidential administration, that kind of ban would be presumptively unconstitutional. The previous cases about abortion before the court had made it very clear that you can't prohibit abortion that early in a pregnancy. But with the new composition of the court, states have been passing more and more restrictive abortion laws. And this was the case they decided to take up to revisit the legality of abortion and the principle that abortion is a fundamental right under the Constitution. And in this case, as we long suspected, the court said abortion is no longer a fundamental right under the Constitution, and states can restrict access to abortion or ban abortion based on the state's interest in, quote, prenatal life. And so any abortion ban whatsoever, including complete bans with no exceptions, are now permissible. And it's back to the, sort of, quote, back to the states to decide in laboratories of democracy. And of course, if people don't like it, they can vote for other people to be their lawmakers. But that ignores the reality of what our voting system looks like and how undemocratic our systems are, and racist restrictions on voting access and all of those things. But that is where we are right now. And many states have already implemented their bans, and there's more to come.
And that the same people are at the same time restricting voting rights.
Exactly.
At the same time, they're talking about voting being the solution, which is kind of crazy.
Yes.
Some other things about Dobbs that seemed, very strange, I think, to a lot of people. First of all, that at least 3 of the justices at least said at some level during their hearings that they supported the idea of stare decisis. And this case seems to have said, we don't really care if this was precedent because it was wrongly decided, which seems to be a new way of looking at stare decisis. Do you have any thoughts about what happened there, or what? I mean, is it just pure power politics, or are we just looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's stare decisis unless you disagree, and I think that there is no deference to the institution and to the decisions of prior justices and the reasoning behind those decisions. I mean, this was part of a week, like 1 week, in which the court revisited Miranda rights, revisited the federal agency's ability to regulate issues within the EPA and the environment. So it undermined Miranda. It undermined administrative agencies' authority to regulate in their area. It undermines Indian sovereignty. I mean, it was a blistering and head-spinning week of judicial decisions from the Supreme Court. So it didn't start or end with the Dobbs decision, but the Dobbs decision stands apart in one particular way, and it's the first time that a fundamental right was designated by the court and then taken away entirely. We can talk about how voting rights is similar in that it's been gutted, but this is the first time that the country has lost a fundamental right, even if it's lost it functionally in other ways, in other places. This is unabashedly, overtly, this was a fundamental right, and it is no longer a fundamental right. So
another kind of weird thing that happened is there was this, when the decision leaked, and pretty soon after that, the court basically confirmed it was a legitimate leak. At least Roberts did, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And yet, for like the whole interim time, every time you saw an article about it, everyone would say, if the Dobbs decision, like there was some real question of if it was going to actually, somehow they were going to rewrite the whole thing, or what do you think was going on there? I know I'm getting a little off topic, but these were kind of interesting Dobbs thoughts I had during the.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many conspiracy theories about it. And I think that, we all were holding out hope, maybe unrealistically, that the blowback was too big, that that Roberts was going to pull someone to his side, and he made clear that he disagreed with the framework articulated in Casey, the last major abortion rights case, although there have been many others, but that he felt like doing away with the standard was ill-advised. And so I think everyone was holding out unrealistic hope that in the time since the leak to the decision, that maybe some composition of the votes would shift, and that there was a mystical majority decision floating out somewhere that allowed that maybe did away with the existing standard, but allowed the 15-week and then found that the 15-week ban was unconstitutional, or that set a new line instead of the existing standard that we have. So the undue hardship standard. So I think it was entirely unrealistic, but I think while we were all prepared for this, it was so devastating to see actually happen that, we're human and we were hoping for a better outcome, even though all signs were pointing to that not being the case.
Even before Dobbs, the criminalization of women was a real and increasing problem. One of the documents on your website had the following kind of summation. Since 1973 Roe ruling through 2020, NAPW has documented more than 1,700 instances across the country in which women have been arrested, prosecuted, convicted, detained, or forced to undergo medical interventions because of their pregnancy status or outcomes. And NAPW has documented more than 3 times as many cases from 2006 through 2020 compared to 1973 through 2005. Can you talk a little bit about how this was playing out before Dobbs? Was just this, they were reading the tea leaves right, or?
Yeah. So the criminalization of pregnancy is not new. And as you described, and we've been seeing a pretty swift acceleration of the criminalization of pregnancy in the past 15 to 20 years. And what underlies that is essentially the same ideology that justifies restrictions on abortion, and the use of that ideology to control the behavior of pregnant people. And that is the concept of fetal personhood. If we designate fetuses as independent and unique entities that are entitled to constitutional rights and protections, they can be independent victims of crime. And the most likely person to be prosecuted for exposing a fetus to a perceived risk of harm or an actual risk of harm, or by experiencing a pregnancy loss, the most likely person to be charged for doing any of those things is the pregnant person. And we have seen this play out in different contexts, but they're all rooted in this concept of fetus as independent and unique entity, separate and apart from the pregnant person. And they can actually be treated by the state as diametrically opposed to one another, which is of course a false narrative created to justify all of this. Because if from our point of view, if you treat and provide resources and support to a pregnant person, both the pregnant person and the fetus benefit. You can't separate their interests out, and you can't treat them as oppositional forces. And so the way that we've seen this play out is laws that were never intended to apply to the context of pregnancy have been used to prosecute pregnant people. We have seen felony child abuse and child neglect laws be used to prosecute pregnant people for being pregnant and using drugs. We have seen murder, manslaughter, feticide laws being used to prosecute pregnant people for experiencing a pregnancy loss and being incorrectly, unscientifically blamed for causing that loss. We've seen pregnant people be charged with similar laws or similar criminal violations for self-managing an abortion outside of the parameters of sort of the state mandates of abortion care when Roe was the law of the land. So this has been happening for decades. We have seen it increase in frequency in recent years, and we see it in particular states more than others. And we see the people who are targeted are not everyone, right? It's going to be people who are poor, people who are drug using, people of color, who are consistently targeted more than others. And like any system that polices people, it disproportionately impacts already marginalized groups.
And I guess there's kind of three baskets of things that happen here. You've kind of got the kind of, what used to be considered the kind of more conservative solutions, which are like exceptions for the life of the mother or exceptions for rape and incest or things like that. Then you've kind of got this other kind of area of all these things that become criminalized, like you were just mentioning, taking drugs at the wrong time, which we'll talk more about in a second as we go through some of the case studies or cases that you all have dealt with. And then you've also got the people who are actually trying to get an abortion and get criminalized. I think, is there any way to kind of put I think a lot of times people talk about one of those things to the exclusion of the others. Is there a way to kind of put all those things in the same kind of human rights basket, I guess? Because I think people try to divide them out to try to, and I think the reason maybe we got where we are now has something to do with this kind of constantly, shrinking this circle and shrinking this circle, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Oh, yes. I mean, you've absolutely nailed it. And it's one of the reasons why our organization had to be founded separate and apart from the major reproductive rights organizations. They were focused on access to abortion and didn't have time or space to focus on the criminalization of pregnancy. But the same forces are at play in both. And it's racism, patriarchy, fetal personhood. And we have done a disservice to the movement by thinking of them separately and of not thinking about access to abortion as also a criminal justice issue, or issues surrounding economic justice and voting rights, and all of these are all interconnected. But specifically when we talk about the criminalization of pregnancy, the idea that a pregnant person is not entitled to their own decision making and bodily autonomy and the same rights and freedoms that everyone else has, because they are the host of another being that has been vested with all the rights and privileges and protections. That is just the same reason why people want to restrict abortion access, or use that to justify restricting abortion access, as they do to criminalize pregnancy. And most of our clients historically have been people who have had wanted pregnancies. And I think even in the mainstream abortion rights movement, it's kind of hard to talk about people who have wanted pregnancies. They're so focused on, maintaining access to abortion and destigmatizing abortion, that we often forget that many people, a large percentage of people who choose to have an abortion, are already parents. So we are not really talking about different populations. We're talking about the same population over at a different point in their lives. And so we need to be talking about these together. And I think what this decision has forced us to do is at least start to think about them all as criminal justice issues now, because everyone is facing criminalization. The patients, the providers, the helpers, we're all in this now together. And I've started to see just in the past few weeks, a lot of those silos breaking down, because it's a crisis and we have to act as if it's a crisis and start working together.
Well, let's talk about some of the cases that you all have dealt with. So I think it'll give people a wider view of the ways that this criminalization could potentially come down. The first case that I read about was Adora Perez in California. Miss Perez, based on the poor advice of counsel, pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter of her fetus, a crime that at the time, I don't know if it still does or doesn't, exist in California. Miss Perez experienced a stillbirth in 2017, which was attributed without scientific basis to her use of a controlled substance. This seems like a number of problems. There's a lot of things going on here. First, why was a prosecutor trying to get someone sentenced for a crime that didn't exist in the code? I guess is the first question.
I don't know that I can answer that exactly, but what is clear from the legislative history of the law under which he sought the original, he charged her with, not her plea, which is a provision of the homicide statute that created the crime of feticide, exempted from it actions consented to by the pregnant woman. And that was written with the intent to ensure that pregnant women would not face criminal charges for the loss of their pregnancies, whether that was because they sought an abortion or anything else. And the Republican lawmaker from 1970 who sponsored the bill, both in legislative testimony and then subsequently when the first woman was charged with this in the 80s, I believe, wrote in that case, this was never intended to be applied in this way. So we have a law, a feticide law, that was passed with the intention of protecting a pregnant person. There are 38 states now with feticide laws that basically create a status of victim for a fetus when there's an attack on a pregnant woman and she's harmed and the pregnancy, there's a harm to the pregnancy. So you can charge two separate crimes. But what's happened time and again is that the pregnant woman is charged herself. And in this case, he brought this charge. Ms. Perez was indigent and had an attorney she didn't choose who advised her to plead to this non-existent crime. That the crime of manslaughter of a fetus doesn't exist in California. It still doesn't exist in California, not for an external actor who harms a fetus or a pregnant person who harms a fetus. It just does not exist. And in subsequent California cases, the California Supreme Court determined that it is unconstitutional to plead to a crime that doesn't exist. And so we were able to use that along with her local counsel to argue that her plea was unconstitutional, and the court agreed and released her. And then the DA in the case decided not to start all over with the underlying murder charge. So she is currently released and trying to put her life back together after serving 4 years in prison on an 11-year sentence.
And I think, what I think about in a post-Dobbs world here is that while that might not be illegal in California, I suspect it probably would be illegal in a lot of other places. And we're not necessarily talking about people who are attempting to have an abortion. We're talking about people who took drugs that the prosecutor might think could be attached to danger to the endangerment of a child. Is that it doesn't even have to be death, right? It just has to be in some way harming a child.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yep. So there are 3 states right now where the highest court in the state has interpreted their criminal laws to apply to fetuses. Oklahoma being the most recent one in 2020. That case that went up to the Oklahoma Supreme Court was a felony child neglect case, but the same principles have been applied in manslaughter cases, for example. We know of 4 cases in Oklahoma in recent years in which a woman was charged with murder or manslaughter for experiencing a miscarriage or a stillbirth. In one of those cases, Brittany Pula, who we now are working with, she experienced a miscarriage at 15 to 17 weeks pregnant. She was 19 years old. She went to the hospital. She shared voluntarily that she was using meth and marijuana during her pregnancy. She was charged with manslaughter. She was held in jail for a year and a half during COVID, couldn't make bail, and went on to a 1-day trial. And was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison, which she is currently serving right now. And that's the minimum sentence for manslaughter in the state of Oklahoma. Her lawyer did not put on any witnesses on her behalf. And the medical examiner's report listed a whole host of possible contributing factors for the miscarriage. It did list methamphetamine as a possible contributing factor, but ultimately determined that the cause of the miscarriage was unknown. And we have been working with many medical experts, all of whom have said that methamphetamine does not cause pregnancy loss. In fact, if it did, you can imagine more people would be trying to access it right now for that purpose. But despite that, despite the lack of medical evidence, despite the lack of causation, she was still convicted, and she is serving her sentence right now in Oklahoma in prison.
And I could certainly also see people being prosecuted for endangering a fetus or endangering a child in one of these states where someone might have used drugs even prior to knowing that they were pregnant, if the law sets up that life begins at fertilization. Am I crazy here, or am I?
You're not at all. And we have seen in these states that exposure alone is essentially per se felony child neglect. You don't have to show that the fetus or the baby once born has experienced any harm, has any symptoms of withdrawal or any other transitory or temporary conditions associated with the drug use. Because for in nearly all cases, these are, if there is any symptoms of withdrawal, it is transitory and temporary, and the best treatment is to keep the mother and the baby together. But you don't even need to prove that. You can show that there was a positive tox on a drug test that was done at the hospital of the baby or the mother, often unconsented to, often not even shared that that's happening. And in so many cases that we've seen, there's false positives, or I shouldn't say false positives because it's actually positive, but it's because they used Sudafed or a prescription for ADHD or something else, medical marijuana, for which they have a lawful certification for. Because pregnant people have medical conditions that don't go away when they're pregnant or become worse when they're pregnant. So we have seen wild and bizarre and horrifying cases of mothers being separated from their newborns because of a single unconfirmed positive toxicology at birth. And sometimes when meconium is tested of the baby, that could trace back to something that happened weeks or months ago, and they may have had a prescription for something weeks or months ago and decided not to use it, but that still shows up in the baby's meconium. It is Kafkaesque when you think about all the ways in which pregnant people can be, and certain pregnant people are surveilled and policed, and the outcomes are so deeply traumatizing. People are unable to breastfeed, they're unable to see their newborn, their other children that they have custody of may have to be removed from their homes while all this is going on. We have a case right now in which a woman is still experiencing postnatal bleeding and is in jail because of a single unconfirmed toxicology test, and her partner can't even give her sanitary pads or underwear. They've turned him away. So that's the trauma that is being inflicted on new parents by the state right now.
It's, I think a lot of people, their immediate pushback will be, well, prosecutors won't prosecute this, which is clearly not true, because we're talking about cases where they are prosecuting these things, and these new laws literally give them a lot of new ways novel ways to prosecute these cases. So in my experience, prosecutors tend to prosecute as a general rule. I don't, is that your experience too, I'm guessing?
Yeah. What's been a learning experience for me, which I'm sure you are much more deeply familiar with, is that we vest prosecutors with so much discretion. One county is prosecuting dozens of these cases. You go to the neighboring county, they're like, I don't care. This is not something that I care about. This is not what I want to use my limited office's resources on. So this becomes just, if I'm a prosecutor that thinks that I can quote, save babies, I'm going to use this to do that. And, the trauma, the lack of any medical support for doing this, the fact that there'll be worse baby and family health outcomes because of it, doesn't matter. And I think that in so many of the cases that we've seen that have allowed these cases to persist, where courts have said, yes, this child abuse law should be applied to fetuses, is because a single prosecutor decided, I'm going to try this legal theory out. I'm going to decide that the law that was intended to prohibit someone from taking a child into a homegrown meth lab, it should be applied to someone who takes drugs, prescribed or otherwise, during pregnancy. I'm going to try that out. Well, it worked. And now in Alabama, we've seen almost 600 of those cases in the past 15 years.
And I think you mentioned one of the cases in Oklahoma I was going to talk about a little earlier. But I think another thing people are really concerned about is how this plays out with miscarriages. There are people who legitimately have miscarriages who, in many cases, I think will probably be prosecuted. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that as we try to predict the future, miscarriages will be swept up into this in larger numbers, because we know that people who use medication abortion pills, it looks medically indistinguishable from someone who's experienced a miscarriage. So if you are experiencing a miscarriage and you need medical attention, you call 911, you go to the hospital, you go to your provider. And at some point earlier in your pregnancy, you shared with someone in your life that you were stressed out about being pregnant. You were unsure if you could afford another baby. You expressed some ambivalence about being pregnant. That could be weaponized against you. And that miscarriage is now suspect. And so that will open up a lot of people to the possibility of an investigation, an arrest, or a prosecution. And it may mean that we will see more miscarriage-related prosecutions or investigations, but it also is a mechanism by which people will be policed for actually self-managing abortions, which is going to be even more common. Those cases have happened. We've worked on many of those cases in the past. But I think we will probably see more of both of those kinds of cases. Again, if a prosecutor wants to do it, they have the tools that they can use to do it, unfortunately. But one thing I want to be very clear about: no laws currently, no abortion bans currently, or any other laws explicitly criminalize self-managed abortion, with a couple specific exceptions. So if a prosecutor is going to prosecute someone for self-managing an abortion, they are going to use another law, and they're going to try and get that legal theory to stick. So they're going to exceed their authority, and they're going to go rogue, and they're going to use another law to try and address this, because they don't have currently laws in most states to do it directly. But again, there's so much discretion available to prosecutors, and courts are often deferential in ways to these ideas, or open to these ideas. So it's a bit of an open question. But I just want to be clear that and the other piece of this too is that the current abortion bans on the books do not criminalize the pregnant person either. The focus is on the provider. But again, we will see, what a prosecutor attempts to do. And then we come in and other groups come in and we shine a light on it. We try to hold them accountable. And we, make all the legal arguments we can make as to why this is impermissible.
And I think a lot of times people misunderstand some things about how the courts work. Like, for instance, yes, it's great that people like you are coming in and trying to help these folks. But as you mentioned before, one of the ladies that you helped ended up spending 4 years in prison before that help actually manifested itself. I think people think it's like some kind of magical instant process, and that you can't, in the time before you get relief, and most people don't get relief, that somehow magically everything goes great during that time. And that's not the case, right?
Right. And I would say, even let's back up even further. You have someone who's under investigation. You have someone who's arrested and charged. Their mugshots all over the media. Their name is in the news, or even just the local news, which matters even more for their community. They're separated from their kids and their family. They can't go to work. They're highly stigmatized, because we're talking about people that have been designated as bad mothers, right? In all the ways that our society judges women or people who can get pregnant. There's so much that happens even before we get to make those legal arguments, right? There's, if the person can't post bond, they're in a local jail indefinitely. With Brittany Pula, she was there for 19 months before she even went to trial. So, the system is so stacked against defendants, as you know, and this is not unique to this area of the law at all. But, and then the vast majority of these cases we might never know about. We're a small organization with 3 full-time lawyers. We don't have access to every case, and we can't swoop in every case. And so we can only help on the ones we know about, and the ones we have resources to help with, and the ones that we may actually think have a fighting chance. Because in some states, the ways the law have been interpreted make these cases so common, and there's very little we can do to stop them.
So you talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's also the notion of people who have legitimate health needs, have medicine or get medicines for those health needs, and then also are pregnant. One of the cases that stood out to me was Kimberly Blaylock, who was charged for renewing a prescription for pain medication while she was pregnant in Alabama. Am I getting the facts of this basically right?
Yep. So Alabama's law, the one I mentioned earlier, is called chemical endangerment of a child. It has been for 10 years, it was applied to people who are pregnant and using both illicit substances and prescription medication. After some really fantastic investigative reporting in 2015, there was outrage around the fact that women who were using antidepressants while pregnant pursuant to a prescription were also facing criminal charges. And the law was actually amended, narrowed to not apply to the use of prescription medication during pregnancy. A rare legislative victory in that state. So Kim,
Alabama, doing criminal justice work, trust me, Alabama's definitely one of the worst.
Yes.
The top 5 territory there for.
Oh yes. And number 1 for pregnancy related criminalization. Kim had a long-term back condition, degenerative discs in her back, exacerbated by a car accident. She is pregnant with her 6th child. She was a long-term pain patient at an orthopedist.
Well, I just want to emphasize this. She already has, you said this is her 6th child. So it's not like she's trying to, she's even if you're one of the people who are, right to life or whatever, this is a case where someone actually had no intention of aborting a child, I suspect. I don't.
No, that's in all the conversations we've had with Kim, this was a wanted pregnancy. She's an amazing mother. She was refilling her pain medication prescriptions. She was actually not taking them for most of the pregnancy until very late in the pregnancy because the pain became unbearable. She was very open about her prescription medication at the hospital. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And the prosecutor tried to charge her, we think, with chemical endangerment of a child. We got involved pretty early and explained to him that he can't because the law has been amended. She was using prescription medication pursuant to a valid prescription. He then turns around and charges her with prescription fraud, which we think is the first time this country anyone has ever charged anyone in this country for engaging in fraud because they filled a prescription while pregnant. And
I'm laughing to stop from crying.
Yes, I know. I understand. His theory of the case is that she intentionally withheld the information about her pregnancy in order to continue getting her pain medication. And in order to establish that she engaged in fraud, she would have had to have withheld material information that would have changed the course of this relationship with her doctor. And what the prosecutor didn't know is that maintaining your dosage for pain medicine while pregnant is actually the standard of care, and that managing your pain medication while pregnant poses fewer risks to the fetus than actually cutting someone off from pain medication, because that can cause withdrawal and other symptoms that are very dangerous and can cause pregnancy loss. So in fact, what the prosecutor was theorizing is that the doctor would have cut her off if he had known that she was pregnant. But actually, the doctor would have kept her on. And how would she know that? She's not a doctor. She's not reading what the CDC recommends as far as
opioids. Obviously not a harm reduction specialist.
Right, exactly. And
she's not a public health person. We'll put it that way.
And also, there was a factual dispute. She claimed she shared that she was pregnant. They also never asked her whether she was pregnant. So are we all, as people with a capacity for pregnancy during childbearing years, required to carry a sign saying, like, I may be pregnant? Even if you don't ask me, I'm under a legal obligation to disclose my pregnancy status. So we ultimately were able to get the charges dropped after about a year of speaking with the prosecutor, filing various motions. But ultimately what turned the table was the prosecutor speaking with a whole host of local medical experts, essentially saying, we maintain women on pain medication throughout pregnancy regularly. Like, this isn't even unusual. Like, this is normal. And the idea that, she withheld this material information with the intent to defraud her doctor was just so not close to the reality of things. But I don't know if we would have gone to trial if we would have won, because there's a standard that people hold pregnant people to that is just so outrageous and so unrealistic. And we often do not win at trial. And so we work to try and get charges dismissed before trial. We often will win on appeal, but trial is a very, very hard thing for us.
Well, I mean, that's the reason why, 90% of over 90% of all cases are won by the prosecutor, and over 90% of all cases are plea bargain, because people don't want to get to trial.
There's no risk. The risk is so extreme. Yeah, exactly.
I think it's 96% of cases that go to trial are won by the prosecutor. I could be wrong on the exact stat on that, but you mentioned this before too. I mean, there used to kind of be a consensus when these laws, it was kind of one of their ploys when they originally started doing this stuff, that the laws would not be used to punish the woman. They'd be used, or person who was pregnant. I don't want to exclude other possibilities, and not. So it'd be a bit more about the providers and that seems to be changing fairly quickly. Am I wrong about that? Or?
Well, I think that's a narrative that's very helpful for the anti-abortion folks is, we never want, or, historically have never wanted the pregnant person to be the one facing criminal charges. I think that's actually changing. I think the in what I've been reading, what my understanding is that there's a bit of a splintering in the movement, and things are moving more and more extreme, as we've seen with the lack of exceptions for rape or incest, which even, practically speaking, functionally, those exceptions are meaningless and I think a real distraction. But even, the fact that we're seeing laws being passed that have none of those, I think demonstrate just how further extreme the movement has gone, the anti-abortion movement has gone. And I think there is a splintering of this idea that, well, if abortion is murder, pregnant women should be charged criminally. Historically, though, the narrative has been, we don't want to charge the pregnant woman. We're going to go after the person who provides the abortion. But what I say to that is, then why are you passing fetal personhood laws? Fetal personhood laws redefine what a human is under your state's criminal code. If you're going to do that, you are going to criminalize the pregnant person. And that's exactly what's happened. And where has the outrage been from the anti-abortion folks about these 1,700 cases that we've documented, most of which involve a wanted pregnancy? So,
well, and it's also not exactly a great thing necessarily to go after providers. I think everyone's familiar, probably to some extent, with the recent case of the 10-year-old who became pregnant as a result of rape. I think first people were shocked by it. Then anti-abortion folks were suggesting it never happened. Then those same folks were doxing and going after the abortion provider. We've talked a lot about the dangers to pregnant women, but there are also a lot of risks and different levels of risk to medical providers. I saw a clip just on earlier today on CNN where a doctor was talking about now being worried that they always have to reach out to lawyers before providing treatment of any kind when they're dealing with anyone who could be potentially pregnant. I know you probably don't focus on this stuff per se, but this has to be a clear and present danger both to people trying to provide care to women and other people who might be pregnant, and also to women and other people, and also to providers.
Absolutely. I think, when we think about criminalization, we've been doing this work for 2 decades, but the folks who have historically represented the providers have been the constitutional rights folks, the ones who say, I'm going to represent the providers so that they can provide procedures to their patients. And they've been the plaintiffs, the clinics, the providers have been the plaintiffs in all of the major cases that have given us these rights to begin with. And all of a sudden now they're going to be criminal defendants. And they are now putting their own liberty and safety at risk, and also the lives of their patients, because now this becomes a decision that the legal department at the hospital has to make, and they don't know what they're, no one knows what they're doing before they can even treat a pregnant person. And so I truly think that we are going to see people die. We are going to see people deeply traumatized. We already have. I mean, there are reports of people having to labor and deliver 16-week-old fetuses that have caused massive amounts of bleeding and trauma. And, and it's just a complete and utter, and we think about it with the 10-year-old case, it's just devastating. We are treating pregnant people with the capacity for pregnancy as less than human, because we have valued the fetus above all. And so I don't even, we talk about fetal personhood, it's almost like fetal supremacy. When we look at this balancing, what's supreme? It's the fetus. And even if you're not pregnant but have the capacity for pregnancy, we're seeing rights being stripped away. So it's really, really, really dark. And all I can keep doing is like ringing the alarm bell about what we've seen before, so it can educate us about what we're going to see now and in the future.
One of the bases for the Dobbs decision obviously was federalism, but the way state lawmakers are responding seems to bring into question ideas like privacy, patient-doctor relationships, freedom of travel, and even interstate commerce. Was federalism, is that, is the court correctly apply? Does federalism, is it supposed to work that way? I guess. I mean, it seems like I seem to remember a supremacy clause and some other things. It's been a while since I've dove into this stuff, but
right. Well, I mean, it's like in the gun regulation case out of New York, there's no concern about reaching into states and saying, you can't do that. But when it comes to abortion and a privacy right rooted in the 14th Amendment that has to do with bodily autonomy for half the population, they're actually saying, we're going to send it back to states and let them decide. So it's like selective federalism. And I think it's just all outcome driven. We're going to latch on to whatever theory advances our personal mission. And I think that what I find most concerning is, you see Kavanaugh and his concurrent saying, oh, interstate travel guaranteed, not a problem. People can travel. It's like, that's even more specious than the privacy rights undergirding the 14th Amendment. That's not that didn't exist in 1868 in the 14th Amendment. That's like, we are being incredibly selective over the principles that are supposed to sort of provide for an organized democracy, because we are just looking at outcomes. We are just looking at, this is my ideology and I can use it, and I will use the tools that I have to interpret the Constitution and laws in a way that gets me to the outcome that I want.
I mean, that Kavanaugh little bit seems, even for him, kind of absurdly naive. We already talked about kind of the length of the legal process and how bringing charges can happen before there's ever relief. And we've also got this kind of novel enforcement mechanism that states have been trying to play with, called civil enforcement, where people can sue people. And so you've got all these cases that are probably going to come about. Like, say, for instance, there are states that are definitely experimenting with the idea of allowing people to bring suit against people for leaving the state to get an abortion or, whatever. Is that just intentional bad faith by Kavanaugh, or is he really, I can't believe he's that, clueless. Not that you're like a Kavanaugh mind reader.
Right. It's so hard to know. I truly
this is the same guy who was waxing poetic a couple years ago about bringing back firing squads and hangings. So,
I also don't, he's the one who had that calendar from his time at the college or boarding school. With his drinking games and whatever else. I truly don't know if it's just, if it's what allows him to sleep at night, maybe. To be like, oh yeah, people can just travel. That's easy because everyone has a couple $1,000s to spend that's available to them to pay for the procedure, to pay for 3 nights at a hotel, to pay to travel cross country. So even just the practical, sure, you can just travel across to another state. Go after you. And if they do, we'll just, the case will just come up to the Supreme Court in 5 years. And then we'll say that was impermissible. So you're fine. To me, the Supreme Court is so, at least the conservatives on the Supreme Court are so far removed from the struggles and realities of so many people, and they only talk to each other, it seems. Right? They're only talking to people in the Federalist Society.
I was going to say, and the Federalist Society.
Right. There's no diversity of opinion. There's no diversity of experience or background or education or anything. It's literally I don't know that they have ever encountered anyone who has had to get an abortion in challenging circumstances, or maybe even talked about having an abortion, period. There were certainly briefs filed on behalf of hundreds and thousands of people who've had abortions, including former Supreme Court law clerks and partners at firms, and things that they would care about, or seemingly people who they might have interacted before. But, it's sort of like the Lawrence versus Texas decision that found the sodomy law, the anti-sodomy law in Texas, to be unconstitutional. That the story that I've always heard about that case is that all these former law clerks came back and announced that they were gay, came out of the closet to their former bosses, Supreme Court justices, and said, you claim you don't know a gay person, you know me. And that was the story of sort of seems quaint at this point in time, but 20-ish years ago, that was a major narrative. And I just think that there is such a lack of empathy and understanding of how people live their lives right now. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett's questions during the Supreme Court argument was essentially like, well, you can just, adoption is so easy and you could just drop off a baby at a firehouse. So what's the problem? You know, that's seriously, and that I think made it into the majority opinion, but there's safe haven laws now. So despite the fact that Black women are, you know, depending on the state you live in, 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth, that, you know, being forced to give birth to a baby that you do not want is trauma, that most people who end up not accessing abortion actually don't choose adoption in the end. We don't have, you know, pregnancy discrimination laws are not robust. We don't have paid child care. I mean, like, but you could just be pregnant for 9 months and experience all the complications that this country allows to persist, particularly for people of color, and then just drop the baby off at a firehouse and move on with your day.
And there's also groups like the Association of Christian Lawmakers utilizing the language of human trafficking to describe abortion seekers and providers who administer abortions to people who travel across state lines. As someone who's worked on those kind of things, this kind of language creep, is this... I see it in other areas of criminal law all the time, but it's always a bad sign when you're seeing this kind of creep.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I worked, this is far afield from this topic, maybe, or maybe it's not anymore. But when I worked on anti-trafficking stuff, I mean, there was always this like lasciviousness to the interest surrounding it because everyone assumed it was about sex. But most of the cases I worked on were about labor trafficking of adults, you know, people, undocumented folks, immigrants, people who were, you know, convinced to come to the United States under particular terms, and those terms shifted as soon as they got here. And so I was always very wary of sort of the religious rights co-opting of a lot of this and using it to sort of talk about, you know, it's sort of their perverse interest in sexual things. And
you also see them use it a lot against sex workers.
Oh, completely. Like yes. And justify, yes, absolutely. And justify restrictions on the ability for sex workers to be on certain platforms and to, you know, and to move them into more dangerous and difficult ways of earning a living completely. And so but they have been so brilliant at marketing their beliefs and their strategy over the years. Not only that, but I think what's actually has been far more effective, because the vast majority of Americans do not agree with this decision, is just getting people on the court. Singularly focused in getting people on the court has been more effective than trying to change public opinion or use, you know, different messaging.
Yeah, I think I've said many times that they spent several decades really working incredibly hard to do something that seemed impossible. They pulled it off, and we didn't fight them very well. That's exactly unfortunate, but it seems to be true.
Yeah, and they do it in so many ways. Like this, we're just outplayed.
There's also surveillance issues, like birth control tracking apps and big data being used against women. Do you have? I assume you have concerns here as well.
I do, but I think they're not dissimilar from the concerns that criminal defense folks have had for a long time around data surveillance. So I don't think the period tracking apps are where we need to be worried about. I think it's going to be the more mundane text messages, Google searches, things like that are already weaponized against people. I think that people who are handing over their devices to police, because police are very coercive about this when they're doing investigations, you know, they may be arrested on a drug possession charge, and then the police get access to someone's phone and they see something about, you know, pregnancy or abortion. That's, you know, so it's going to be sort of the ways in which we already see this information weaponized. It's just the net has expanded because police and prosecutors are going to have a vested interest in identifying, you know, the ways in which someone might have demonstrated their interest in getting an abortion or their ambivalence about being pregnant through their digital footprint. And as we talked about earlier with miscarriage cases, I think my prediction is that the way that a prosecutor will distinguish a miscarriage from a self-managed abortion is by looking at who they spoke to, via text or on social media platforms, what searches they did on Google, and we'll try to build a case through that kind of circumstantial evidence.
That's very disturbing. I mean, you can literally do searches for anything that doesn't, you would hope that people know that doesn't demonstrate intent, but apparently it does in some courts. One other question that seems pretty important to address, at least theoretically, law enforcement resources are zero sum. So it seems like that resources used, for instance, to investigate someone who had a miscarriage could not be used to investigate maybe a gun homicide. This creating a whole bunch of new novel ways to criminalize people who could be pregnant. Is there a real risk that this also trades off with public safety in a lot of less predictable ways?
It's possible because, as you said, offices have limited resources, so you're going to take resources away from something else. But my concern, frankly, is that states will just allocate more resources. Police budgets are ballooning. Prosecutors' offices, I imagine. I'm less familiar with the budgeting process for that, but I think that there can be an argument to be made by a prosecutor that they need more funding because they have all these new criminal laws to enforce that they didn't have a few days ago, a few weeks ago, a few months ago. So, we have seen a massive, I don't need to tell you this, but we have seen a massive expansion of criminal laws in this country that didn't exist in 1973. So, when we talk about what happened before Roe, most women were not prosecuted, although some were. And the narrative that no one was is incorrect. And there's the case of Shirley Wheeler that galvanized people at the time, a woman in Florida who was prosecuted for an illegal abortion. But the criminal legal system in 1973 is unrecognizable compared to the criminal legal system in 2022. And the ways in which we criminalize poverty, we criminalize we criminalize mental health issues, we criminalize public health issues, we criminalize education issues. Like, it is just an entirely different infrastructure than we had in 1973. And so just as the war on drugs transformed our criminal legal system, our police budgets, our prosecutor offices, I could see this being very similar. It's destabilizing, but it's also a way in which prosecutors can make the pitch that they need more money.
Well, I think at the very least, it would mean that if you were right about that while we already have, the largest system of incarceration in the world, that could multiply. And in many places, for instance, in Michigan, our women's prison is already incredibly overcrowded. And there's only one prison because, of the ratio between women and men. And that obviously, this could raise the bar in a whole new way in terms of increasing the amount of incarceration in the country.
Yep, completely. And, we've been working with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And I know their executive director has said this, that and others associated with the group, that this looks to them like the war on drugs, the ways in which new laws are passed at warp speed, that we're seeing things change on a daily basis in different states, and that there's such a possibility of an expansion that will be transformative for the field of criminal defense and for obviously people's lives, the resources that are allocated to prisons, the resources that are allocated to police and investigative methods. So, I don't want to be overly hyperbolic because we could see a lot of pushback. Like, I think public opinion is with us on many of this stuff. And so holding prosecutors accountable, shining a light on these cases, we have an opportunity that we shouldn't take for granted to ensure that if this is happening, that people know about it and that people get outraged over it, and that we bring in the medical community and that we bring in the public health community, and that, maybe there's pushback. Maybe they finally reached a point where they've gone too far.
Yeah, I've talked to some people, even anti-abortion people, who feel that a lot of these laws have gone too far. Does that, I mean, it sounds like maybe you feel a little hope that we're going to get the resistance is going to somehow beat the empire on this.
I have to have hope because I can't, I just have to. I think their game is to make us give up hope and to just be in despair and be disempowered. And I think that we have found really, really strong and good advocates in the most hostile of places when it comes to reproductive rights more broadly. I think building the connection between people who have wanted pregnancies and people who are seeking abortion is really important, because prosecutors won't care if you're pro-choice or pro-life, to use sort of the old terms. If they're going to prosecute you for a pregnancy loss, or because you exposed your fetus to some perceived risk of harm, or in some of our cases, which are not criminal, a hospital gets a court order to do a cesarean that you don't want because they are worried more about the fetus than they are worried about you. Like that cuts across the silos of anti-choice and pro and abortion rights. And I think making the connections there is incredibly important. And then I think we also need to look at this as a criminal justice issue. There has been such momentum behind understanding how the war on drugs has been so devastating and such a disaster for so many Americans. People need to start to look at this as a criminal justice issue and to start sort of like activating those resources around criminal justice reform and sort of understanding this within that broader picture.
Unfortunately, this has been a bad couple of years for all of us on the criminal justice reform side.
That's true. Yes. Yeah.
I do hope that that would help. I would hope. A lot of this kind of sounds like we've been talking about today sort of sounds like a horror movie. Are there ways that you would recommend that people kind of best look out for themselves during this period of both uncertainty and terror for a lot of folks?
Well, I mean, it's really, some of this is incredibly hard to stomach, even myself, to sort of say. But I think that there's a lot of really good information out there about protecting oneself and their digital footprint. Digital Defense Fund is an amazing resource that has some specific abortion-related content around using secure servers or secure websites that don't track you, using VPNs, using Signal for text messaging. I think if you are looking to access information about abortion medication in a state that has banned abortion, I would highly recommend you check that out first. And then I also think that there's, keep your information, keep your personal information to a very tight-knit group of people. Unfortunately, some of the cases we've worked on have involved a family member, a neighbor, an ex-partner reporting someone to the police. And that I think is possible here. I think that also those SB 8 civil bounty laws have sort of activated this idea that everyone can be an agent of the state. So we have to be very careful about who we share this information with. And then, if you are in a position of privilege with respect to disposable income, I would really support you or encourage you to adopt an abortion fund in a hostile state, in a southern state or a state that's banned abortion, and donate monthly. This is not a need that is going to go away. And I worry that as we move on to the next crisis, people will forget. And the funds are money in, money out. The money comes in, it goes out to support someone getting an abortion. So they need people to stay with them. So if it's $5 a month or $10 a month, they need people who are committed to staying with them and continuing to support them, because the need won't go away, but the attention might.
My friend Amanda Alexander always talks about the power of dreaming big and of having freedom dreams. This season, I've been asking people about their freedom dreams. Can you share any dreams you have? I suspect some of them will be getting rid of these laws, but
I don't know. I often don't think big enough, I think, but I would love to see a world in which everyone gets the care, the prenatal care or the pregnancy related care that they need without any state involvement. I don't want to see the police involved in anyone's care. I don't want to see the child welfare system involved in anyone's care. I want people to be able to get free, good, supportive, compassionate, comprehensive prenatal care, whatever that looks like, culturally humble, culturally competent, linguistically available. That is my dream. That because so many of our cases originate when someone is seeking care. And to weaponize the site at which you are seeking care in a medical emergency when you're delivering your baby is just, where are people expected to turn? So that is my dream, that we can create a system that treats pregnant people like grown-ups, like they are the best experts on their needs, that they are full humans with all the rights and liberties that every other adult in this country is given, and also that we reform our system of care so that it is better and so that it is completely divorced from any state involvement.
I also like to ask people if there are any criminal justice related books that they like and might recommend to our listeners. Do you have any favorite books?
I thought about this one. So Policing the Womb by Michelle Goodwin. It's criminal justice, but it's all about these cases and about this work. And it's brilliant. And she's a law professor in California and a brilliant writer and thinker. I would also, this is not creative, but Just Mercy. It's a lot about Alabama. I also love it because as someone who now runs a nonprofit, it's also about like building a nonprofit and like all the ways in which you're pulled in 1,000 different directions. And my tiny, tiny claim to fame is that a friend texted me when that book came out that Bryan Stevenson cites a law review article I wrote when I was a baby lawyer as a footnote. And it was like my most proud accomplishment ever that I have a footnote in that book.
Oddly enough, one of my proudest accomplishments is there was a Columbia Journalism Review article that interviewed both me and Bryan Stevenson, and so we're interspersed with each other throughout.
That's amazing.
I was like, I'm like paragraphs away from Bryan Stevenson.
Yes, there you go. We have a very similar proudest accomplishment moment. So those books are transformative for me in this work. And then I would also say Killing a Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, which is sort of a reproductive justice classic, but also talks a lot about the criminalization of Black women in particular in the 80s and 90s, laying the foundation for all the cases we see now.
I always ask the same last question. What did I mess up? What question should I have asked but did not?
I don't know that I have an answer. You've asked so many great questions.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I just always think there's probably something you would like to talk about that I didn't get to.
I think that's a good rule to have, but I've talked your ear off. So I will say that I think we've covered a lot of it today.
Great. Well, I thanks so much for doing this, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me here.
Thank you so much for talking about this topic and for bringing it into the broader criminal defense space.
Great. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. You can learn more about this episode in the notes or visit our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and please like this episode and leave comments below. Special thanks to Andrew Stein, who does the editing and post-production for me, to Ann Aspo for helping with our transcripts and social media images, and to Alex Mayo, who helps with our website and does the video transcription. Make sure and add us on social media and share our posts across your network. Also thanks to my employer, Safe and Just Michigan, for helping to support the Decarceration Nation podcast. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. See you next time.